Uncharted 4 proves that some of the best video games are movies you occasionally press buttons during. Each and every level is a carefully designed roller coaster filled with action set piece after action set piece, doing exactly what the developers want you to do but feeling absolutely cool as hell doing it. Every inch lost in terms of an actual game takes a mile in cinematography. Even ignoring the highly detailed and well-acted cutscenes, you are always at most 5 minutes away from a stunning view. You climb beautiful Italian vistas, parkour on Panamanian pavilions, suavely scale the sandy scorching sights, and sneak your way up and around the spires of Madagascar. This game is mostly climbing and that's fine. While cinematic masterpieces in video game form had already been a long tradition, Uncharted 4 is undoubtedly in the highest echelon of just how enthralling video games can be. It's gripping, it's fun, it's beautiful, and it came out 10 years ago. 2016. In 2022, there was this comparison video by IGN between Uncharted 4 for the PS4 and PS5's Legacy of Thieves remaster. Can you see a difference? Well, I hope it was that the PS4 looked better because I swapped them. The only tangible difference I can tell between the 2016 and 2022 versions of this game is the frame rate going from 30 FPS to 60. Over the course of 6 years, this video shook me to my core. While there has undoubtedly been graphical improvements over the past decade, the rate has slowed down to the point where it's getting hard to tell when something came out. Halo 1 undoubtedly released in 2001. It is by no means an ugly game, but like all developers, they worked with what they had. 3D animation was very early into its lifespan still, and they needed interactive 3D environments. So facing this, they put emphasis not on textural fidelity or smoothness, but instead went all in on atmosphere. Baked-in lighting, smooth, futuristic, repeatable textures, and grand, spanning skyboxes where the big picture, literally big picture, was far more important. Almost every mission takes place inside, and nearly every outside area is conveniently contained by cliffsides either towering far above or falling far below. Halo 3 released 6 years later. In the same span, we went from the PS4 to PS5 remasters, swap them again by the way, we went from this to this. The scale of Halo 3 in every sense is massive. Wide landscapes, complex battles, gigantic enemies, colossal set pieces, even the story is larger than life. The final action sequence of Halo 1 is the biggest the game gets, and yet is still an enclosed racetrack curated to maximize every small inch it costs to render everything in front of you. Halo 3's final mission is also a life or death escape using a warthog, but just look at it. Explosions all around you, complex physics interactions, a sky looking like it's set on fire, music swelling as everything falls apart, threading a thin needle through a world in utter chaos on the verge of collapse. Huge pillars fall down and smash through tiles, hordes of enemies work in unison. A full 7-minute chase left down to one final death-defying jump. 1/40th of this level would crash a console just 6 years before. Halo 1 is small in scale because it needed to be. Halo 3 is massive because it could be. And games year after year have only gotten more advanced. As we reach closer to a game indistinguishable from reality, taking more and more money and higher specs to run, the question that's been clouding my mind has me, instead, looking backwards. Will we ever have retro games again? In fact, what even are retro games? This isn't a slide transition to explain the basic concept of a retro game, it's a genuine question. How do we define them? Also, it actually was a slide transition, I'm gonna explain it now, you can't stop me, it's fine. What's commonly accepted as a retro game is actually debated. For a long time, in the breakneck progression of what games could do, retro more or less meant video games from superseded consoles, previous generations of gaming. However, if you ask most people if a PS3 is retro, they'd say no, and I honestly don't think that will change even 20 years from now. And that's crazy, because it came out in 2006. The PS3 had GTA 5, The Last of Us, Batman Arkham City, Call of Duty Black Ops. Yes, these games look a lot worse than they would nowadays, but you can't deny their resemblance to our world. Video games have existed for 50 years, and yet we have gone from this to this. If we're defining art mediums by their limitations, video games have almost none. Surrounded by rapidly progressing technology, they had no time to sit and form into a defined shape. Each era could only be worked on for at most a period of 10 years, and so the direction of video games as a medium became quite obvious. Mimic other ones. It is the little brother of art, growing up in a world far more globalized and blanketed by art and information and news, and became a vessel for all of it. The interactivity is both the selling point and also made irrelevant for the sake of the story. For decades, being on the cutting edge was a necessity. Every little inch of growth meant more resources, better textures, higher fidelity sound, literally more game able to be stored on cartridges. The biggest game studios and consumers alike were so used to the cutting edge that the cutting edge became the selling point of every new release, even as processing power and storage flew beyond the reach of developers. This pressing against limitations forced games to be stylized. They weren't just stylized against their will in the now iconic pointy polygonal shapes and pixel art, but actually forced to go somewhere horizontal instead of vertical. They can't depict reality, so they need to depict something else. Attempts were still made, of course, but each one was a failure because it invested in realism at the cost of gameplay when the equation just couldn't work out yet. But then came the PS3 and Xbox 360. From the 7th generation onwards, gaming at the highest level and highest budgets has more or less been one style: realistic. The uncanny valley was outright jumped, our brains registered these people as real, and from that point on, AAA gaming was put on one artistic line. This is the cutting edge now, and to most AAA studios, you're either on it or you're not competing. The era of retro games was the closest we've had to having style-defining limitations. It was the most distinct that video games ever were. So again, the big question: will we ever have retro games again? No. But also kinda, but actually yes. With an asterisk, but also just yes. Okay, let's go step by step. No, AAA studios are not going to start suddenly making retro games again. They only made them because they had to and jumped ship the moment they could. Even Nintendo, a wildly successful company focusing on much more cartoony and stylistic games, know the way the wind is blowing and have been since the early days. They took part in the shit-brown realism era. Even further back, they led the charge switching from 2D to 3D, even having their 2D side-scrollers have 3D models now. Most consumers don't want to buy a game that looks worse and runs worse than they're used to, and Nintendo is not throwing themselves into bankruptcy for the sake of an artistic victory. If anything, they make the most use out of modern specs for the sake of actual gameplay. But we still are kinda getting retro games, at least in spirit. Retro is not just in the looks. Beat-em-ups and Metroidvanias and point-and-clicks, core pieces of some people's entire childhoods, were left in the dust in search of more and better, except the people who played them didn't magically disappear. Every aspect of the older eras of gaming has been disassembled and carried on in the form of indie games, not just due to nostalgia on the behalf of the creators, but through limitations. Indie developers don't have the same problems as we did in the past, but they do have consistent ones. Money is the first one that comes to mind. Money buys time, assets, software licenses, plugins, and most importantly, other people to help you. As more consumer-grade tools have hit the internet, it's become technically possible for one single person to make an entire video game. The issue is that it tests just about every technology-related skill out there, as well as taking years at the minimum for a decently sized product. However, out of any single resource an indie dev can't buy, the biggest gap is in assets. Audio, 3D modeling, texturing, voice acting, animation, sound effects, UI. Before you can even make all the parts work together, you need the parts. Each individual asset takes ridiculous skill and even then ridiculous time to make. Artists are always the largest portion of a major game studio, more than the people who make the game part of it, simply because so many and so varied of things need to be done. With such a cliff in front of anyone wanting to make a game, the only way to make it over is to scale it down. While companies in 2004 were making GTA San Andreas, one of the biggest independent games that year was N. Just N. N is a Flash game, Adobe Flash being one of the only early accessible ways to make video games, and it looks like a Flash game. If you've never seen it before, you've likely seen the many others it ended up inspiring. The entire game takes place in this vague gray square, as bare bones as physically possible, with the only meaningful physics interaction being your character's body parts being blown to pieces after hitting a mine. Instead of its looks, every bit of the game's resources pooled into its gameplay. The ninja feels very heavy to maneuver, similar to 3D marble games, stopping and starting taking a great deal of effort, and momentum carrying heavily until it's slowed by you or by force. Besides a few hazards, mines, missiles, and moving blocks, this is the whole experience. 500 levels worth. Yeah, did you think I meant the time was spent fine-tuning the movement or some shit? No, with assets this simple, you could make so many levels, and they made so many levels. It might look like a Flash game, but it takes on average 12 hours to beat, and this is just the first version. N+ released 4 years later, featuring 2,360. I'm cutting myself off there because who gives a shit? N++ trounces it, mogs it, whatever the fuck you want to call it, with 4,340 levels. If you want to fully complete the game, it will take 400 hours on average. Why? Okay, I'm getting off track. Focus on gameplay works for indie games because gameplay is reusable, so long as your character doesn't need to move through a fucking movie set and brand new locations for every moment the game is happening. Roguelites are the single best example of this, the entire game being more or less winnable in 45 minutes, but honed to such perfection that people want to replay that game with slight variations thousands of times. However, while photorealistic art is out of the picture for indie games, they still need art, and are still regularly beautiful. In fact, few games nowadays look anything like N. So what do you do? Well, 2004 was an important year for indie gaming for another reason. While everything before this point was frankly crude in multiple ways, the first Flash game to get real attention was about something I can no longer mention if I want this video monetized. There was one anomaly, a game years ahead of its time in so many ways it can hardly be counted. That game goes by the name of Cave Story. Cave Story was not made with Flash. It was not made on any engine, not any known one. It was custom built over the course of 5 years from the ground up by one single person, Pixel, and became a shining example of everything indie games would eventually turn out to be. In place of voice acting, it returned to the then out-of-date text dialogue, the then out-of-fashion 2D side-scrolling, and more importantly, the largely abandoned style of pixel art. And while it took on these things seen as burdens of the past, Cave Story cleaned up anything out of date with the higher processing and modern design standards of the mid-2000s, shedding dead weight and becoming an icon through sheer word of mouth, having released entirely for free. Yes, the gameplay was a major focus of Cave Story, but the pixelated style allowed a robust world to be made, filled with dense, atmospheric areas to explore. The story of the game, fitting to that title, is also incredibly important. Saving on everything else allowed for the writing to get that focus, a story that's simultaneously funny and heartbreaking, and stuffing as much intrigue as it could possibly fit. Very few games are so good that they inspire someone to make a New York-styled rap concept album walkthrough for it. In fact, it's just this one. I'm not kidding.
This place ain't safe, but it will be. Failed my friends and now revenge is the only thing left to fill me, so thrill me.
Soul healing, genuinely. Through the Limits, Pixel borrowed from his childhood and revitalized an art style left more or less to rot, and while it would likely have happened anyways, this revival of retro techniques on the big stage interwove indie and retro in a way that would never be undone. It's not just due to nostalgia, of course. Retro and indie is a relationship of convenience. Pixel art is not an easy art style, no art style is, but it avoids many of the hardest aspects of drawing and most importantly takes up very few resources and file space. Even bad pixel art can often be passable, i.e. the Undertales of the world, and even better, you're able to get all of the benefits without any of the horrific restrictions of the actual development of the early 90s. It's like retro, but with a modern twist. That being said, nobody would earnestly call a game with pixel art inherently retro, and many revived genres have managed to evolve past their roots to the point that they're no longer an artifact of the time either. So then, what would count? Well, how about a good remake? It's one thing to borrow convenient techniques, and it's another to source an entire game from a past era. Yes, we do get retro games, with one giant asterisk. They're still painfully, clearly from the modern era. Pseudo Regalia is a 3D Metroidvania, styled in every way after PS1 graphics, sound, and game design. You play as Cybele, a goat-like creature traversing a surreal castle in a dreamlike world, having only yourself, the small creatures to guide you, and your movement to find your way to the very top and free the princess. The premise is almost sickly sweet in its simplicity, screaming out a nostalgia for simpler times with simple plots and simple goals. The game was made originally in 3 weeks for a game jam, but was received so well that it was added onto for another 4 months and released to Steam. Now, give or take 5 months is not the longest time for an indie game to be developed, but its simplicity allowed for a lot to be put into the final product. It takes around 5 hours from start to finish, collecting all 5 keys and freeing the princess, a not unsizable amount of time for an indie game of this ambition, but considering the 5 months of work, much of it was spent trying to hone the specific qualities of the PS1 aesthetic. That eerie fog, that music that feels both soulful and hollow, even that slight awkwardness to animations and enemy AI. The PS1 comes from an era where we could almost make the things we wanted to make. Grand stories with objects resembling living creatures, polygons close enough to real shapes, but not close enough to pretend they aren't just triangles. Every era of gaming was unique, but the 5th generation was very specific. More and more, as people hit the age to develop games entirely on their own, the 5th gen aesthetic has started to flood the market, and most do a passable job. Shipwreck 64 is maybe the most average example of this. The goal of most of these games is not to capture a perfect image, but the mental image of a perfect image. The audio might be a bit crisp, the movement a bit too smooth, but the goal is only a feeling, and that distance from a true capturing of the technology of the time does well to remind us that this is an indie game. As well, abandoning that need to be perfect allows a lot of basic quality of life features to enter the experience. Actually tolerable camera controls for one, as well as bigger levels, more assets, and more tools for shaping the environments you want. Pseudo-Regalia, on the other hand, is too good. Or rather, both too good and not good enough. It commits far more than any other 5th gen recreation I've seen, and yet, it just doesn't look like a PS1 game. Look at the UI for a second. Ignoring that it's this Art Deco influenced style that just wasn't popular in the 90s or the aughts, the diagonal lines are normal. The PS1 was a marvel of its time, but it did not have anti-aliasing. Hell, the lowest resolution of the game is technically the max resolution that the PS1 came with, but functionally it ran at half that resolution to prevent problems, and that made jagged pixelated edges that were unfortunately iconic to the style. Our protagonist, Cybele, is, well, designed like a furry character, but simply has far too many resources piled into her. The jagged look of these characters was, again, not coincidence, but practicality. While looks are important, if your main character is a textured black hole sucking up precious resources at every moment, you can hardly craft a world for them to move around in. This is the time of Halo 1. Clothes and jagged hair were convenient because they could hide the much more complex, less triangular form of human bodies. This might all sound really nitpicky, but Pseudo-Regalia earned it. The game is so close to authentic, but fails just enough times to land squarely in the uncanny valley. Textures seem compressed instead of pixelated. Animations feel like something smooth being chopped into pieces instead of made for that limit. Sound effects and music, one of the main ways for this era of games to give real expression in place of animation, is hardly given mind. The core problem holding it all back, keeping it at the bottom of this design pit, is that while developers in 1997 were pushing as hard as they can forwards, indie developers nowadays are working backwards. It's impossible to intuit why each decision was made when you don't have the same restrictions, when you're not pressured by a timeline to push whatever tool available to you to its maximum, to make something artful, something entertaining. Pseudo-Regalia is a fantastic game, but one that suffers from the conditions of its creation, miming the walls that enclosed the developers in the past, while anyone playing, impressed or otherwise, so clearly sees that these walls just aren't there. But what if you could make them there? There's this YouTuber, you might have stumbled across him, named Kaze Emanuar. Now, there's been about 1 million Super Mario 64 fan games and parodies, it being one of the most important platformers of all time, but Kaze decided not just to make a fan game. For nearly a decade now, he's been diving into the code of the game itself, optimizing and freeing up space with one goal: to make his own sequel, fully playable in cartridge form on the Nintendo 64. There's been a niche but growing movement in the indie scene, programming brand new games able to work on real retro consoles, and dealing with all the restrictions that implies. Real limitations with harsh caps on file size, processing, visuals, everything technical entirely authentic to the times the originals were made. Good Boy Galaxy is one of my favorites to come out of this movement. Made for the Game Boy Advance retroactively, it feels more authentic than any game I've talked about so far. With the limited palette of the Advance, expression was pushed more towards anything relatively cheap. Color binds together all of these games, being one of the main ways to paint a mood to a scene, but sound is where they really come to shine. Even in the PS1 era, audio was less intensive than 3D animation, so any effort in expression leaned on sound to get across what it needed to. Screams, music, power-up noises, music, weapon fire, music, a lot of music like at all times, way more than modern AAA games use. Any story came through text, and it being the only way to give this all meaning was a major part of most games, often focusing on good writing to make up for what it lacked. Good Boy Galaxy ticks every single box, a deeply pretty story-driven puzzle platformer soaked in every moment with equally colorful music. These games span every era, from Alwa's Awakening for the NES to Demons of Astaborg for the Sega Genesis. Like a lot of indie game movements, tools have become increasingly available to make it possible to do this at all without building from the ground up. But that's not what Kaze is doing. Kaze is specifically optimizing an already existing game for the purpose of adding more to it. More complex mechanics, bigger levels, higher frame rates, but doing so on the original software. And he has done insane work. Every bottleneck and limit has either been doubled or halved, whichever is better for it, which has compounded into far more than double the performance of the actual game Super Mario 64. There was a strange feeling I get from these videos, seeing such a legendary piece of art be sort of demeaned. Not made to look worse, but its guts criticized and easily fixed with nearly 30 years of hindsight by some random guy. This isn't a top industry professional doing it, but rather a passionate nerd with an interest, a microphone, a PC, and a game console. We can so plainly see this magical thing for millions of kids as nothing but plain code, and code that is deeply improvable. These lines created the world that changed so many lives, ghosts of keystrokes and their imprints, each individual letter more valuable than its developers could have ever dreamed of. And alongside them now are hands from 30 years in the future, making small changes, shifting some things around, getting these old gears turning better than they ever had. If retro games can still be made, what could be closer than this? The real limits, real challenges, real code from a time long past. Yes, we do have retro games again, and yes, we will continue to get them. You need only to look for yourself. But also just no. No, I cannot in good conscience tell you that this is a retro game. It's on original software, literally on the same program as Super Mario 64, working in the restrictions of the time, but who are we kidding here, really? This is a mod. Good Boy Galaxy is an indie game. Kaze is using modern understanding to improve an old engine, modern design concepts for the brand new levels. It is so clearly a game made by someone in the era of Uncharted 4, of realism and its dominance, a world knowing what video games can and have become. In fact, it's a response to it. Kaze is not just a developer, he is a YouTuber, and a popular YouTuber for the niche he has and does. Optimizing old game engines is not exactly something that gets millions of views by itself. The drive and fascination with it is because the videos are about Super Mario 64. People who were not even born when it released are fascinated with the game and those like it, far more than Super Mario Wonder or Call of Duty Black Ops 3. These games aren't special just because they're retro, they're special because they're distinctive, and even more that they can't be replicated. They were made literally in a different world, not just with different design standards and budgets and technology, but a different culture, different people, different views of reality itself. Others might disagree, set a line at one point in the answer I gave before, or even think the PS4 is officially retro. But to me, while indie games carry on that long tradition, to get retro games again, we'd first need to invent a time machine. Or, instead, we can appreciate them for what they are. I choose the latter. This is my Patreon section. If you don't want to be here, leave. For the past few months, every single weekend, I've been hosting an event called Lakeside Chats, a Patreon-exclusive book club but for anything audiovisual, movies, television, and most often YouTube. We vote each week on the day and thing we're watching, and either discuss afterwards or just hang out and have a nice time. This week we did a Game Changer Marathon, the game show where the game changes every show. If you're interested in such a concept or just want to support me financially, consider subscribing to my Patreon. Outside of Lakeside Chats, we also have a Discord, one that anyone can join but patrons get special access in. Not only do you get a custom color, but also access to a patron-only chat as well as Ask the Judge, a channel where you can ask me literally anything and I will answer it beyond what should be a reasonable depth. Lastly, patrons get their names shown on screen, and if they pay $5 or higher, get their names shouted out at the end of videos. That being said, special Patreon shoutouts to Martin Lewis, Brambles Hopper, Edmund Dong, MF Bitchboy, Owen McGee, Wayne Wheeler, Cat Called Blep, Lucky on Fleek, Beating Guitar Guy, Damage 43, Artelis, John M, Dom Creative, Crazy Rooster Eye, Freya Core 1440, Opposite to 5150, Oreo, Bestest Patron Jacob Falk, Robert Michael Becker, Ted H, A Simple Lamp, Ro Ramden, Jocelyn Owen, Stickman Mayhem, Gerberly, Fake Milk, Rudy Schubring, Peter Healy, Christian Cook, Celestial Tangle, Kevin Paulson, Poetry Stud, Necra, MC Logic Master 69, R2, JP Benini, Tricky Goose, Nicotina, Danny Miller, Crimson Aurora, Sistine Capella, Umbrella, Truman Tietmeyer, Pixel, Lucy G, Z Kong, I Love Aqua, Artemis, Sir Rhino, Ambient Isotopy, Diablo Star, Lucy Tara, E. Hrabenka Haraka, Beatus, JCat, Brokeboy 200, Joy McStinky, and Matthew Craig. Thank you to everyone else who subscribed in the lower tiers, and of course, have a fantastic day.